This is my second time recording this, but today has a little bit more promise than last time. It's raining outside, there's a cool breeze. I have an office in my window, and right now it's open, so I can get some of that fresh air and listen to the raindrops on the grass and on the sidewalk outside. And despite the rain, some of the local birds are singing away their beautiful songs. I actually like days like this. I find the rain to be calming and soothing, and it's not so cold out that I can't have the window open, so I get that nice, clean, fresh air of a recent rain. I'm also recording this on a Friday, and this weather, although not super promising for the outdoor activities that we have planned for tomorrow, is a fitting cap to a week that has been rather difficult and complicated, if I'm honest. The game that we're talking about today is called Vampyr. It's possible that it's pronounced Vampyr, but the developer, Don't Nod Entertainment, is based in Paris, and according to Google Translate, the French word for vampire is Vampyr. I'm not going to try the French pronunciation. I considered it, but after trying it a few times, it was obvious that I should not. And so I'm going to call this game Vampyr, not only because it's developed in France, and that's the French word for vampire, but because I'm going to be talking about vampires in general a lot in this video. And for the sake of clarity, we'll keep the two separated. I apologize, I have to keep clearing my throat. The downside of weather like this is that I've got a little tiny bit of a cold. Not so bad that it's impeding me in any way, just bad enough that I got to clear my throat every couple seconds. Now, I'll be honest about Vampyr. I was surprised to find myself playing it. I'd seen the release of the game. I'd seen some trailers and a few gameplay stuff and some reviews. Not very in-depth reviews, but just some passing reviews about the game. And man, I thought it looked interesting. I liked the dark atmosphere, and it kind of seemed also... What's the word? I can't think of the word. It seemed mysterious. I guess that's a good substitution for the word I'm really looking for. It seemed mysterious. It seemed like anything could happen, right? Because you're in the streets of London and it's dark and it's foggy and there's monsters and there's hunters and there's citizens out, and it just seemed like there's a lot of possibility there, especially the ambiance and the environment. And so it was on my radar, but I didn't think that I would actually play it. I didn't have any concrete plans to play it. I would have liked to, but I didn't have those plans. Now, before I get into the game too much, I actually want to pull the curtain back a little bit and talk about how I decide which game I'm going to play. Just to kind of explain how I went from not thinking I would ever play it to having played it and now doing this little discussion about it. First thing that I need to explain is I really don't have a lot of time to play video games. It's a hobby of mine, as is this, but it's not really one of my primary priorities. I have a business that I run full time, and I also have a large family. I have a loving wife and 4 great kids, and they're all amazing, and I love spending time with them. But having that many people in the house, it requires a lot of attention. Each one of them, I have a special relationship with each one, and that relationship needs to be upkept, and that, of course, takes my priority. That's my first priority. I'm also going to school full-time to get a 4th college degree. And I guess maybe I should address that too, because having 4 might sound a bit excessive. I have an associate's degree that I got back in 2012. And then I got a bachelor's degree a few years ago, and then an MBA right after that. So now I'm going back for another bachelor's degree. And why in the world would someone choose to do that? The short answer, without going too much into things, is because I wanted to. And that's about the long and short of it. The first degrees I got were primarily for the sake of expedience. It was important to have those degrees so I could get the kind of job I wanted. But it wasn't necessarily the field I wanted, and so I wanted to study something different, something that was interesting to me, not just profitable to me. And so I'm going back, and you might think, well, why go to college? There's so many courses online. I know I'm getting a little sidetracked here, but I'll answer the question. The question that you supposedly posed to me. And the answer is that I really thrive in an environment that has that type of accountability with the deadlines and people who are holding you accountable. Learning stuff online is great, and I've learned a lot of stuff online. Most of the stuff that I've learned, all of the skills that I've honed and whatnot, were learned online. But when it comes to certain things that I find particularly difficult, which this degree is a topic that I find difficult, I find it very interesting, but it's also very difficult. And for that type of stuff, it's easy for me to kind of lose motivation. Usually I lose motivation about 75% of the way through, and that's a bad time to lose motivation because you're so close to the end. You just have to push through a little bit longer. And so in this case, I didn't want that to happen. And so I went ahead and enrolled in an accredited institution, and now I'm working on a degree. Now it's a kind of a long explanation, and especially for this video that doesn't really rely on it. But my point is that I have a lot of competing priorities, and so playing through a video game that will likely take tens of hours to play is, well, let's just say I have to be selective about which games I'm going to play. And so how do I select? Well, it's kind of simple. I just play whatever looks interesting, but I don't really play just one game at a time, not most times anyway. Usually I'll pick up a few games. I'll install several games, maybe 3 or 4, and then I'll start playing them, and I'll see which one sticks. And as I was getting ready to move on from Dragonfall, which was the last game that I'd completed, I had installed and played several games. I installed and played Dark Souls, and I have really mixed feelings about Dark Souls. On the one hand, I do love it, and I think that's kind of a video all on its own. And if I ever complete Dark Souls, I'll make that video. But I guess now's maybe not the time. In addition to Dark Souls, I also installed and played The Witcher 3. I got about 5 hours in, and you know what? I could tell that Witcher 3 is a really good game. It's polished. It's fun. It's good. But it didn't stick. I also tried Avernum 2. Now, if you watched my Avernum 1 video, you know that I loved it. And so I was really excited to get into Avernum 2. And the fact that it didn't stick this time is not, in any of these cases, really an indication of like the quality or how fun it is or anything like that. This is very much a it's not you, it's me type of situation, where in reality it was me. Let's see, what else did I play? There's a few other games that I kind of picked up, and maybe I put an hour or two in, but it just didn't really stick. And so why did Vampyr stick when all those other games didn't? And some of those games are, arguably better objectively. As if you go and look at the Metacritic score, it's better. But the reason that Vampyr stuck, really, I think, is because of the atmosphere. I talked about this a little bit already, but it's a heavy, dark game. The entire game takes place in the aftermath of World War I and in the midst of the Spanish flu. And because you're a vampire, everything happens at night. You never really see the sun. And that's not all. It has an amazing soundtrack. I really, really enjoyed the soundtrack of this game. It is a mix of deep, dark, somber strings, and there's some choral arrangements too that are really well done. And your character, whom you play as, is Dr. Jonathan Reed. This isn't an RPG where you choose a character. I do consider this a role-playing game because you are playing a role, but it's a very defined role. And so it's not a role that you choose for yourself, per se. You don't really choose the tone that Dr. Reed speaks in, although you do get to choose what he says. But I don't think that detracted from this particular game. I think that with this game and this story, I think I'm okay with this. But Dr. Reed is intelligent, he's educated, he's a doctor, and he's a master of his craft. But he's also a bloodthirsty monster. And the game alternates between exploring this dying city and talking to these morally gray characters, and a combat system that I can really only describe as being Souls-light with a T. And I think I'll get more into that a little bit later. But I want to paint this picture for you. It's dark, it's depressing, it's heavy, and at the time it was exactly what I needed. When I first started playing Vampyr, I really didn't think it would stick, actually. It seemed very linear, especially at the beginning. And even when the game opens up a little bit, I felt like it was just too linear. It felt like I was railroading me on this path. It didn't feel like the open world was open quite enough. So I didn't think it would really stick that much. But despite that, I kept thinking about it. I would think about it when I was working, or when I was at the gym, or when I was cooking, and I just kept thinking about how the last fight went, or how the citizens in my current district were doing, or how I'd like to upgrade my character and Jonathan's abilities. And I think that's because, just like Vampyr, oh, see, look at me making mistakes. Just like Vampyr, life can be dark and depressing and heavy sometimes. And instead of trying to escape that, I think sometimes what we need to do is lean into it and face it, or find a way to face some sort of virtual approximation of it and then overcome it. That's why, Vampyr is a fun game, but I didn't really play it just because it was fun. I also played it because it was cathartic. You're going to see in this footage that I really wasn't particularly good at Vampyr, at least in the beginning. I think you'll probably see me die in this footage. I think you'll see me backtrack and get lost, and you'll see me make a lot of mistakes. But sometimes life's like that too. Alright, let's dive in. Vampyr is, of course, an action, role-playing, and adventure game developed by Don't Nod Entertainment. And these are the same folks who made the Life is Strange series and a few other narrative adventure games. I have never played any of those games. I don't care for those types of games. I think the only game that I really played that was kind of along those lines was The Wolf Among Us. I played that several years, and that was a pretty good game, but I'm just not drawn to those games as a rule. But Vampyr is actually quite different. And so I think it's different enough that having not played those games doesn't really matter too much. The game was released in 2018, and it's considered a AA game. So what that means is that while production levels are mostly pretty high, it didn't get really the same budget as like a big AAA game. And I think that you see that in Vampyr. I think that some of the systems are maybe not as fleshed out as they could be, or they don't provide as much flexibility or freedom as it could. But I don't think that really distracts too bad from the game. I think the game is still very well put together and very fun. Now, I want to give you the same disclaimer that I gave you in my Avernum Escape from the Pit video, and it's this. I really liked Vampyr. I may even play it again on a different difficulty in the future, because the way that they do difficulties is really interesting, and I'm going to dive into that later too, so I won't go into it now. But I think I will play it again in the future on a different difficulty. Having said that, I'm going to criticize it a lot in this video. And so, as I'm criticizing it, I want you to think of those criticisms as things that kept a really good game from being great. I don't want you to think of it as, there's this game that could have been good, except that it has these flaws. No, it is still good. It still is good. And maybe it could have been better, but anything could have been better. And for me to talk about the flaws, it's just, it really is subjective as well. It's just my experience. And despite these flaws, I did enjoy the game. And so don't think that it's a bad game or anything like that. And I hope that that's not the impression that I'm giving you. Now, the main, I want to say, gimmick of the game, or the thing that sets it apart from other games, is that you are both a vampire and a doctor. And so you need to progress, and the best source of experience in the game, and you need the experience in order to progress, of course, the best source of that experience is by sucking the blood of citizens. And so, not just sucking their blood, but in that process you are killing them. And the more citizens you kill, the more unstable and hostile London becomes, and the harder the game gets. And so the game really is about balancing your need for blood, i.e. experience points, and making sure that the various city districts remain healthy. And in a nutshell, that really is kind of the gist of the game. And that's an interesting enough premise, and I think they executed it quite well. But if we end there, then we do the game a grave disservice, because the developers put a lot of love and care into crafting this simple but enjoyable vampire story for us. Now, I've mentioned that Vampyr takes place in London, or at least part of London, in the year 1918. So this is very shortly after World War I, and you play, as I said, as Dr. Jonathan Reed, and he's a very accomplished doctor who has pioneered the field of blood transfusion, at least in the game. And he was also a battlefield medic, and he recently returned home from fighting in France. Now, before you actually start the game, you get to choose your difficulty. So this is what I was saying, is this is a really interesting mechanic. There are 3 game modes, as they call it. So there's story mode, in which the combat is much easier, as you might expect, and there's not any kind of reward for finishing the game without killing any citizens. Whereas in normal and hard mode, I believe that there's an achievement that you can get if you manage to do that. I obviously did not manage to do that. And to be honest, on your first playthrough, I don't really recommend that you do that either. I think that the game is meant to be played in such a way where you are kind of selectively killing citizens, and I think that it's balanced in that way too, as far as like combat and stuff. And so I think it's a good challenge for a returning player. I don't think it's necessarily something that you'd want to try on your first playthrough. So that's story mode. Normal mode it's the default mode, of course, and so difficulty increases as you kill citizens, and you can choose the vampiric powers in the level up process. And so that's important because in hard mode, it's different. In hard mode, your vampiric abilities are directly tied to whichever citizens you decide to kill. So you don't get to choose it for yourself on level up. Now, I haven't played through on hard mode. I assume that you still do level up, but you don't get to choose your abilities. And I actually find that really interesting. I think that's a really interesting distinction. And I think that's kind of a natural progression of the game's systems as well. And so if I do play the game again, I will probably play on hard mode. Now, with those differences in mind, it's important to note that I did play through on normal mode. And so a lot of my comments and observations, all of them really, especially surrounding difficulty and progression, they're going to reflect that that was the game mode I was in. But I do want to say also that normal mode is not very difficult. The very last boss in the game only took me 2 tries to defeat, and this boss has a fairly large health pool, and so by the end it really felt like I was kind of like in a routine, and I was just kind of waiting for things to take their place. I was waiting for the boss to do something so that I could do something else. If you're the kind of player that really enjoys challenge, therefore, I think that you might opt for hard mode and find that more enjoyable. Whichever you choose, though, the game starts and you wake up in this mass grave, and we don't know much about what happened to Jonathan before the start of the game, aside from the fact that he was obviously attacked and turned by another vampire, but we have no idea who that vampire was or why we were turned. And as you play the game, you discover that this is actually kind of rare. It is considered cruel among vampires to create someone as a vampire and then to leave them to figure things out on their own. And that is the very first mystery that we have to unravel in the game. As a newly reborn vampire, the game guides us to our first kill, and from there we're introduced to the basics of gameplay, at least to the navigation and combat aspects. We are immediately spotted by vampire hunters, and so they chase us around. They're trying to get to us, and through escaping that scenario, we learn about combat, we learn about navigation. There's also a short introductory quest, which ends in us joining Dr. Swansea at the Pembroke Hospital. And this is where the game opens up a little bit more. So up till that point, it's a little bit linear. There is some freedom, and I'm struggling to decide how I want to describe this. There may be more freedom than I assumed at the outset, because you actually kind of go back to that opening place. You go back there later on, and you see that it is quite open. And so it could be that I felt like it was linear. This could be more of a subjective thing, I guess, is what I'm saying. Anyway, so you get to Pembroke Hospital, and once you get there, the game opens up a little bit more. But right before it does, you're introduced to some of the other game mechanics, specifically interacting with other people. Before we get too much into that aspect of the game, I wanted to talk about the world of Vampyr. Because of the environment that it takes place in, and also the fact that, like I said, you're only ever playing the game at night. Or not that you're playing the game at night. The game only ever takes place at night. And it is London, so often it's rainy, often it's foggy. The game world has this dark and oppressive atmosphere, which I really liked. Sorry, we got sirens going by. If you heard that, I apologize. But what I was saying is, I think that the developers and the artists in particular did a good job at creating this world, and of course, the music just really adds to that. The game features an open world of sorts. There are 4 different districts of London that you're able to explore, and for the most part, the only thing stopping you is the high level of the enemies. The first time you traverse the streets or fight your way to the safety of a new area or discover a new safe room, that experience is really, really well done. The lighting and design of the streets gives you the feeling of a city that's just barely holding it together. Even in the wealthier parts of town, sure, the main streets are clean and safe, but even so, in the distance, you can hear animalistic screams, and in the dark alleys, you can catch movement of something sinister lurking in the shadows. And here and there, you'll see quarantine posters or even catch the occasional splash of blood. But the game world is kind of small. They do a good job at making it feel bigger than it is, but there are a lot of areas that they seem just kind of arbitrarily closed off. For example, one of the ways that you move around in the world is through this sort of teleportation ability. However, you can only use that ability when the game prompts you to. And so you'll often come across areas where you'll think, I should be able to teleport there. And if you could, it would actually make that quest or that traversal a lot easier. But since the game doesn't give you the prompt, you're stuck just running around. It gave me the impression that I could explore as long as I went where the game wanted me to go. There really wasn't that feeling of being able to just wander and explore and get lost however you want. It felt more on the rails than that. And for me, exploration is really one of my very favorite parts of any RPG. And especially in a game as visually interesting as Vampyr, I would have loved to just have gotten lost in the back streets and find new areas that I wasn't directly led to. If you've watched my review of Avernum 1 Escape from the Pit, you know that I really valued the fact that in that game there's a lot of content that you could easily miss if you're only focusing on the main quest. There's areas that are open, like caves and stuff, where you can just wander around and find them, and you kind of get this emerging gameplay from that. And Vampyr, I don't want to say didn't have that altogether as like an absolute. I think there was maybe a little bit of that, but it wasn't to the same extent that I usually like. Also, and this is going to be a very strange complaint coming from me, but it doesn't have a fast travel system. Now, the reason that's strange coming from me is because I usually detest fast travel systems, or at least the kind where you can open up a map wherever you are in the world, open up a map and do a mouse click and suddenly you're on another part of the world. I don't care for that sort of fast travel. I think it's very immersion breaking, and I think it's kind of a cop out by both the player and the developer. And this is just my opinion. I mean, people are going to disagree with me, and I mean, obviously they do, because some of your favorite games probably have a fast travel system like that. But I don't find that to be enjoyable. Like I said, it kind of feels like a cop out, and whenever a developer includes that in a game, I really try not to use it, and sometimes I do anyway. But let's use Avernum again as an example. In Avernum, there is a fast travel system, but you have to unlock it as you go, which is, I mean, that's fairly common as well in game design, and it's reliant on kind of discovering these things, and it's also reliant on a certain faction, so you have to be able to talk to that faction and kind of be in their good graces, if I recall correctly. So why is it a bad thing that Vampyr doesn't have any type of fast travel system? Well, and especially because, as I mentioned, the game world is relatively small, which means that it really only takes a few minutes to traverse the map. My problem is that in Vampyr, unlike a lot of other games, you're going to be traveling back and forth throughout the different districts all the time. Here comes another siren. Goodness gracious, I hope everybody's okay. So you're going to be traveling back and forth all the time, and the enemies respawn whenever you rest or die. Now, this isn't a Dark Souls situation where you do go back and forth and the enemies do respawn. This is a little bit different because you truly are going to every single district almost every single night. And so in between your saves, in between your rests, in between your level ups, you're going to all these different places, and you're having to run through everything all over again, and you're having to fight the same enemies all over again every single night. And it's a little bit more complicated than that too, but I'll get more into that when I get into like leveling up in combat. But let's just say that it never gets easier to make that traversal. I think in an open world game, traversal should be an enjoyable experience. And my problem with Vampyr is that it's really not. Now, in each district, you can unlock one or two safe rooms where you can craft items or level up. And I just think it would have been nice if you could travel between those safe rooms. Not necessarily the safe rooms in the same district, but like between the districts. But as it is, if you need to travel from the docks to the cemetery, which is traveling across the map diagonally, so it's about as long a distance as you can travel, you're going to have to run the distance, and you're going to have to deal with the enemies in between. And, it's only going to take you a few minutes to do it. That's what I mean about the game world being small, but there's going to be so many roadblocks and challenges in the middle of that, if you're just running to the cemetery to grab something and then you're going to head back to the docks, it just feels like a chore. It's not fun. It's a chore. Another thing that I found odd about the world is that despite you playing as a very powerful vampire, you are constantly stopped by locks. Locked doors, locked fences, locked containers. Apparently, Jonathan is just no match for them. The fences are especially immersion breaking because you should just be able to teleport over them or through them. It has that thing where some of the gaps in the fence look like they should be big enough for you to go through. And Jonathan also has a hard time walking up certain elevations. Like, he can walk up stairs that are obviously stairs, but if there's a lip or anything anywhere else, he struggles with it. And so those are a few other gripes I have. Also, it is kind of immersion breaking to there's certain instances of the game where you have to get to a new place, and so you go there and you have to fight past a bunch of feral vampires. You have to fight past the vampire hunters, and then you finally get there, and there's a whole bunch of other NPCs there. And supposedly they got there completely safely and without ever noticing anything out of the ordinary, or at least maybe they're so used to it that they just don't bother to say anything. But I have to wonder, did this old lady with dementia have to fight her way here as well? And when she leaves, how in the world is she going to make it home safely? And yet, you meet her later, and of course she did make it home. And so that's a little bit immersion breaking. Another gripe I have is that the vampire hunters, so there's a faction in this game that of course is hunting the vampires, and they will recognize you on sight as being a vampire. It doesn't matter that you're several meters away, they will recognize you on sight. And yet the citizens that you interact with quite often, they have no idea that you're a vampire. Even when you're in an area that is fully lit and they are looking you right in your blood red eyes, they have no idea. But the hunters, who are several meters away, they're in the dark, they can see you perfectly fine. And so why is that? I have no idea. Probably, if I'm being honest, probably because it would break the gameplay if that were any different. You do meet other vampires, though, who look very human. But by the end of the game, you don't look very human anymore. And so I do kind of wonder about that. Like, why make him look so hostile towards the end of the game when there's other vampires who look fine? And I don't really have a good answer for that. It's just kind of something that kind of breaks the immersion, kind of something that kind of takes you out of the experience a little bit. Despite those things, though, as I said, I really did enjoy the world. I enjoyed playing through it and exploring it. It didn't provide the level of exploration and freedom that I like, but it did have a lot of great atmosphere and ambiance, and I think to an extent that made up for it. In addition to the 4 districts, I guess I should talk about the dungeons. I'm calling them dungeons, but that's not necessarily what they are. There's these closed off areas that you have to load into and that you'll discover from time to time. And these areas were okay too. There's a few puzzles that I felt were unnecessary. They're not super difficult. I'm not good at puzzles. I mentioned this in my Vernon 1 video. I'm not great at puzzles. I like puzzles that require a tiny bit of brain power so that I can feel smart when I finish it. But I don't enjoy puzzles too much as a rule, and these puzzles were kind of they were on the opposite side of the spectrum of the Vernon 1 puzzles, where they were like too easy. I just brute forced these puzzles. I just went in and brute forced it and got through it fairly quickly, which is why I say that it's probably unnecessary, because you could just then maybe included good encounter there or something else instead. But it's a good way to break up gameplay, I guess. I just wish it was implemented a little bit better, or maybe just done something different. There's only a few of these dungeon-like areas, though, and because of that, and because the world is small, you end up returning to these different areas for different reasons throughout the game. I should say you don't have to redo the puzzles when you go there a second time. That would be quite onerous, wouldn't it? Usually, and this is another thing that the game implements that maybe I should talk about, is that it has the Dark Souls-like convention of being able to unlock shortcuts. And so once you've gone through a puzzle area, you're usually able to open a door or a gate that gives you access to that area without having to redo the puzzle. Okay, so let's talk about the puzzle. Let's talk about the story a little bit. After becoming a vampire, the biggest mystery that you have to solve, like I mentioned, is who it was that turned you. And given the strength and power that Jonathan has, it's speculated by a lot of different characters in the game that you must be the progeny of a very powerful and ancient vampire. However, no one really knows who it is. And so that's the first objective that you're presented with. And the next mystery, in my opinion, is actually a little bit more interesting. You find out that in addition to the Spanish flu, it seems that there's a bad case of vampirism going around. Now, this is maybe this is a little bit of a spoiler, but I'm going to say it anyway. I don't think it's too bad of a spoiler. But if you are sensitive to that sort of thing, you might want to skip a minute or two ahead. In the game, there's two basic types of vampires. There's the Echons, and this is what Jonathan is. It's what most people think of in terms of like classic vampires. And then the other type is, and I'm going to butcher this, but it's the Volkods. And Volkods are big bodybuilder-looking vampires who rely on brute strength rather than any type of speed or vampires' abilities per se. They do have those attributes, but they don't rely on them as much as just their bulk and their strength. But in addition to each of these types, there are beastly versions of them that are caused by bad blood. And so the beastly type of Echon is called a Scal. And these are very similar to what you might think of as like traditional zombies. They have some vampiric abilities, but they're much more feral, and most of them will devolve into like mindlessness. So I think zombies or ghouls is a good approximation. The beastly version of the Volkods are simply called beasts. And these are basically werewolves. In fact, as I played the game, I actually thought they were werewolves. It wasn't until after I beat the game and realized that really there was no explanation to there being werewolves in this universe that I did some research and discovered that they are actually vampires. They're the beastly form of the Volkods. I believe that you'll see me fight one of these beasts in the game footage. It might even be playing now. I'm not sure. I record the audio after I record the gameplay, so I'm not sure what you're seeing right now. But anyway, the dirty blood that causes these beastly forms is the other disease that is going around London. And so you are tasked with discovering the source of that bad blood and then doing your best to resolve that issue. So that's the story. And one thing that I enjoyed about the game is that very little of that is given to you easily. Vampyr kind of makes you work to discover the story. The story is told, I'm going to say, through 4 different mechanisms. The first being the most obvious is dialogue, right? There's a lot of dialogue in this game. And as you talk to people, you learn more about them and you learn more about the situation in London and just the world in general. But you can also eavesdrop on other people's conversations from time to time. And this provides you with some really special insight into what's going on as well. Usually this is not worldwide, or I should say maybe like game universe-wide information, but it's in-depth information about those characters that most of the time they would rather keep hidden. There are also collectible items that you can find and read, things like newspaper clippings, books, letters, journals, and I think that that's the way that the game really communicates the lore of what's going on. And I think they did a good job. Granted, I didn't read every single piece of thing that I came across, which maybe you're a different type of game player, maybe you will, but I think given the statistics of the amount of people who actually read the book in like a game like Skyrim, I think most of you are probably like me, where you'll read enough to get the gist, but you may not read the whole thing. Lastly, though, is the environmental storytelling, and this is a less obvious way of storytelling. But if you pay attention to the world around you, especially in the way that it reacts to your decisions, there's a lot of insight that you can glean from that. Now, as for talking to people, this is something that you do a lot in the game. And the mechanics are pretty interesting. When you start a conversation with someone, you have several options that you can go through as far as what you're going to say. However, some of them are grayed out, and it will say hint required, and until you unlock that hint, you are not able to follow that line of inquiry. There are several ways of unlocking dialogue options, but the most common way is to just talk to other people. The people in the various districts, they have these complex interconnected relationships, and they'll often talk about each other. And different relationships and dynamics are revealed through that process of investigation. It's an interesting mechanic. Now, like I said, I don't really play narrative games a whole lot, and I haven't played any of Don't Nod's other narrative games. And so it's entirely possible that this is a very common mechanic in that genre, but and maybe it's just something that I don't see because I don't play those kind of games. Either way, in Vampyr, I think that system was executed pretty well. Now, on the flip side, though, I'll be honest, dialogue can seem pretty linear at times. Like, it sometimes seems very clear which option you're meant to choose first, and if you go out of order, then the conversation becomes awkward because people are responding to things that you haven't said yet. The worst thing about dialogue, in my opinion, is that you can't skip through it line by line. Now, I'm a fast reader, and voice actors are not. Well, they're acting, right? So they're not reading for speed. They're acting out a character, and that dialogue is part of that. And so I would love it if I could just read ahead and then skip to the next line of dialogue, but that's not exactly how it works. You do have the option to skip some dialogue, but if you do, it skips the whole dialogue segment, not just the line that's on screen. So you end up losing information when you do that because they're not completing the dialogue. Now, maybe that's the way that the dialogue was recorded. Like, maybe these clips are longer than the lines that are printed on the screen. I think that's probably the case. And so when you skip it, you're skipping that chunk of text, not just the line. And that bugged me. Voice actors are good, and there's a lot of people who really need voice actors in the game to make it feel immersive or to make it feel more realistic, I guess. I don't know. I'm not that kind of person. I don't need voice acting in my games. In fact, I generally prefer not to have it. Even a game that's very well voice acted, and Vampyr is well voice acted. But right now I'm playing through Vampyr: The Masquerade Bloodlines, and that game has some very, very talented voice actors. But even then, I find myself skipping the spoken dialogue most of the time. And I wish that Vampyr had the option to maybe turn it off, so that I could go through the dialogue text at my own pace. I think that would have helped me to enjoy that part of the game more. But this is really subjective, and I can see why, after paying for voice actors, which isn't cheap, it's understandable that maybe Don't Nod didn't want to give you a way to just shut that off, right? So that's that. Let's get into combat. No. Before I do that, let's get into your character's level. So this game is it's odd because you can competently fight and kill enemies that are a much higher level than you, like over 10 levels higher than you. And Vampyr follows that convention that we've all seen, where enemy levels are shown in green if they're your same level or a little bit weaker. They're shown in yellow if they're a little bit higher than you, and then they're shown in red if it's way higher than you. And in the early game, I assumed that red level enemies should just be avoided altogether, and I figured I need to level up more, and then I could go into those areas, and so I was, avoiding a lot of stuff. That's how a lot of other games that use the same convention, that's how they do it, right? If you see a red level enemy, you stay away. But in Vampyr, that's not the case. For most of the game, I was fighting those red level enemies. And part of that has to do with enemy scaling. Now, remember how I said that running through the districts was annoying because the enemies respawn? Well, part of that is also because of the fact that they scale up as you level. But they don't scale to your level. They almost always scale to be several levels higher than you, into the red. That means that they're going to be difficult fights every single time. Or, well, maybe I shouldn't say difficult, because over time you're going to master the combat and they won't be difficult. But they're going to be long fights because of the health pools that the enemies have and the way that you're hitting right? Because you're not causing as much damage. And so having these long fights for the sake of having just long fights, it's not fun. It's a chore, especially by the end of the game. Most of the time by the end of the game, I was just running past enemies to get from place to place. And maybe that's what you're supposed to do at that point. I don't know. But there are some places that are gated off, and you have to be able to open those gates. But when you're in combat, you are not allowed to interact with items or the gates or doors or anything like that. And so if you run past all these enemies and you get to a gate, then you have to turn around and kill them all before you can actually pass through that gate. And that doesn't happen a lot, but it is like something that you will have to deal with from time to time. And I guess maybe for the sake of comprehensiveness, that's not always the case as far as the enemy scaling goes. There are some areas, like when you return back to areas from like the early game, there are some areas where the enemies stay at a lower level. Not exactly the same level that you found them the first time, but they'll be lower than you are. But even so, I mean, that's pretty rare. It was rare enough for me to see a yellow enemy, much less a green enemy. Most of the enemies that you see are red, to the point where like I actually stopped associating the color with like difficulty because they were all red. So it was what it was. Now, as far as actual combat goes, I mentioned that Vampyr's combat could be described as soul light, and I guess I'll explain that a little bit. A lot of the mechanics are similar to what you'd find in a Souls game. Bloodborne is the game that comes to mind, actually. So if you've played that, I think that Vampyr's combat will feel familiar. Because you are learning movesets, you're dodging a lot, and then you're kind of striking whenever you get that opening. However, the game is much more forgiving than Bloodborne is. The enemies are typically slower. They typically have a more predictable or telegraphed moveset. And death, while it does respawn all of the enemies, it doesn't send you back to your last safe room, and it doesn't cost you any experience. So it's much more forgiving in that sense. In Vampyr, you have an assortment of weapons that you can use. These weapons are not anything that you craft from scratch. You find them out in the world. You typically have a main hand and an offhand weapon, unless you opt for a two-handed weapon, which I never did, so I can't speak to that very much. The two-handed weapons, they hit harder, but they're slower, and so I didn't opt to play that way. If you're going to play a vampire, it seems to me you might as well be fast. So your main hand weapon, of course, is for dealing damage, and then your offhand weapon, it does cause damage, but it also causes stun damage. And when you hit an enemy enough times with that stun damage, they will become stunned. So they'll fall down, and you'll be able to bite them to drink their blood. When you drink blood in combat, it fills up your blood meter, and your blood meter is used to execute your various vampiric abilities. And your vampiric abilities are determined by how you invest your experience points when you level up. So I would consider that to be similar to investing souls in a Souls game. Except, of course, you don't lose that experience when you die. Thank goodness, because Vampyr is not a game I think that could sustain that type of gameplay. But again, all my opinion. Maybe you feel differently. Now, getting back to the weapons, you can also equip a gun as your offhand weapon, and it does cause stun damage as well as normal damage. It's a little bit more normal damage than a stun weapon causes, but a little bit less stun damage. Let me make sure I got that right. More regular damage, but less stun damage than a regular stun weapon does. Anyways, you can use this, though, to attack enemies at range, and there are some enemies who are weak to gun damage, so sometimes that's what you want to do instead. You can also hold a number of potions on you. No, they're not called potions, though. I think they're called serums. Anyway, you use these, and they're in syringes, and so you can inject them to yourself into combat. And this gave me a very Bloodborne vibe again as well, except instead of stabbing the syringe into your leg, you're stabbing it into your neck. And you can use those serums to give you health or blood, or to increase your stamina regeneration rate. I've heard other YouTubers say that they didn't like the combat in Vampyr. They said it felt too stiff. And I disagree. I think that it's different. You have to get used to it. But I actually like the combat just fine. It's a little rough around the edges, but it is fun, and it's not too difficult. When facing a new boss, sometimes I die once or twice. But I don't think I ever died more than twice, except with one exception. It did take me a little while to get the combat, though. When I started the game, I was thinking it was more of a hack and slash, and then I wondered, of course, why I was doing so poorly. Then I got to a certain early game boss, and I was just dying over and over again. This is that one exception I was talking about. And I died so much that I actually kind of rage quit at one point. I was like, you know what, screw this. But coming back to it, it clicked. So during my last attempt against this guy, it finally clicked, and I realized that this is not a hack and slash. This is like Bloodborne. This is like slow Bloodborne. And so in that playthrough, I was able to, or in that attempt rather, I was able to complete it with like 75% of my health still remaining. I will say that combat can go a little too long sometimes. This is especially glaring when you're trying to just traverse from place to place, but it's true for the boss fights as well. In my opinion, a boss fight should last long enough for you to feel like you've learned their moveset and now you can effectively counter what they're doing. It should never get boring or feel like a routine. I know this isn't really a fair comparison, but if you play Dark Souls or Bloodborne, it took me at least a few times to kill the typical boss, several times, sometimes. But when I did, it was like, man, I just beat this thing like by the skin of my teeth, and it really left me wondering if I'd just gotten lucky. And I really had this desire to see if I could, I just wanted to fight the boss again right away, just to see if I could pull it off twice. In Vampyr, I didn't feel that way. When I beat a boss, I was relieved, but not because the fight was hard. I was relieved because it was finally over, and now I can move on with the rest of the game. And I don't think that's really what you want your players thinking when they finish a boss fight. I mean, I know that's not a fair comparison, and all in all, I did enjoy the bosses and the combat in Vampyr, but I think in some ways it could have been maybe touched up a little bit or nicer. But like I said, this is a AA game, and it doesn't have quite the budget that a AAA game has, and maybe for what they had, they did a really good job. There are also a nice variety of enemies in the game, and they're introduced throughout the game, so it's not like everything's introduced all at once. You get that variety as you get further in, and so it makes the encounters more interesting. One thing that I'm kind of torn on, though, is that if you engage an enemy, the sound of your fighting that enemy can actually sometimes draw more enemies in. Now, this serves to make combat a little more interesting, of course, but it also is kind of tough when you're really just trying to get through an area and now you have all these mobs to fight. There was one point towards the end of the game where I was fighting like 6 vampire hunters at once, and 3 of them were ranged and 5 of the 6 did fire damage, which is especially harmful because it keeps dealing damage over time and it's a little bit harder to kill. And out of all the encounters in the game, I think that one was the most difficult, even taking into consideration the boss fights. At one point, I whittled it down to just one guy, and then somehow that one guy killed me, and I was so upset. And there are different enemy types that can stun you or grab you, and so this is really annoying to fight against in a group because you'll get grabbed by one guy, and then he'll let go of you just in time for the next guy to grab you. And that doesn't really feel fair. I think some of those encounters could have been designed a little bit differently. Or you'll be fighting a group and you'll get stunned by one particular enemy, and while you're stunned, all the other enemies will keep beating up on you, and then you'll get shot with a fire arrow, and now you're on fire. And, I mean, it's interesting, but sometimes it doesn't feel fair, and I think that's the problem that I have with it. Now, something else that I need to mention is that there are also named enemies. So these are like vampire hunters or feral vampires, or even like econs or vokods that you'll meet where they're not necessarily bosses, but they have names and they have the longer health bars like a boss does. And usually what it tells you when you run into one of these, I'll call them mini bosses, when you run into these mini bosses, is that they used to be a citizen. Because under the right circumstance, or maybe I should say under the wrong circumstances, citizens can be turned into feral vampires, or they can join the vampire hunters. And so then you have that little mini boss to defeat, someone that you used to talk to, someone that you may have built up some rapport with in the past. And I really like that mechanic. It shows that your actions carry real weight in the game world. And you know what? I'm going to dive into that a little bit more, and I'll do that when I talk about the citizen specifically. But before we get that, I want to mention crafting. I mentioned earlier that you can craft when you're in a safe room. And there are basically 3 types of crafting. The first is that you can craft those serums that I talked about that you can use for yourself in combat. Then you can also craft different cures for the citizen. So when you meet a citizen, they may be suffering from fatigue or a headache or bronchitis, and you can craft different cures that you can administer to relieve them of that illness. And then lastly, you can upgrade your weapons. Now, I mentioned that you can't create any weapons from scratch. You find the weapons out in the world. But after you find them, they can be upgraded with the type of loot that you find. And the type of loot that exists in the world basically can be broken down into those three categories as well. I mean, there is junk that you can find that you can just sell to a vendor, and then there's also quest items. But aside from those two exceptions, most of the loot that you find will either be specifically for serums, or specifically for cures, or specifically for upgrading your weapon. Now, here's my advice, because there are vendors in the game as well that you can buy stuff from, but here's my advice if you're going to play the game is don't buy any cures or serum materials from the vendors. But you can buy weapon upgrade materials from the vendors. And the reason I said that is because the other types of materials, such as the cures and the serums, it's just too plentiful in the world to really justify being bought from a vendor. You know what, though? As I'm saying that, I realized that I also finished the game with over 1,000 extra shillings. And so most of the items that you come across that you can buy are like 60 shillings tops. So maybe this is a case of like I was just hoarding my money. But even so, and there are other items. There's another type of item that I should have mentioned where you can break it down into other materials. Even so, crafting is a pretty straightforward affair throughout the game, though. As you go into harder districts, you'll find better loot, and then you can craft better things. It's pretty standard. I don't really have too much to say about that. I do have something to say about the way that you find the loot. Collecting the loot in this game is interesting in a negative way, I think. Loots, they respawn. So it takes a few days, well, it takes a few nights, rather. But most loot containers, they get resealed and they can be looted again. However, what makes this frustrating is that the lootable containers and the non-lootable environmental objects look the exact same. So you might have a box that's lootable and then a box that's not lootable, and they're the exact same model. The difference is that the lootable containers will have a slight shine to it. But there's two problems with the way that it's implemented, in my opinion. The first is that the shine is so subtle that it is really, really easy to miss. And second, and this one is actually more egregious, is that in-game light will reflect off an item, right? So like a torchlight or candlelight or lamplight, what have you. And when it reflects off an item or an object, it makes it shine. So the image effect of a lootable box, or a box that just happens to be under a lamp, is, as far as I could tell, the exact same. Or so close to being the exact same that as you're running through this game world, it'll catch your eye. This means that you'll constantly be double checking non-lootable environmental game objects because you saw the torchlight reflect on them and you thought it was lootable. Exploration also kind of lacks that reward system as well. So in a lot of games, if you're exploring an area and it turns out to be a dead end, the developer will reward you for exploring with a little bit of loot. Vampyr doesn't always do that. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And so if you're exploring an area and you just don't find anything, it kind of feels like a waste of time. I mean, you get the reward of having explored the area, and I think there's something to that. But also, like, you want to learn something, so it doesn't matter if it's loot that you pick up or like, a newspaper or a journal entry that you can read. You want to do something. You want to learn something more about the world or get something out of it rather than just hitting a dead end. Okay, so there's a few things I want to talk about kind of as a group. These are quests, the relationships that exist between the different citizens, and then how you can kill citizens to get more experience. And I'm going to do this by referencing the in-game menus. I know I'm not showing them, so you'll just have to imagine it. I'm sorry, maybe I'll figure out a way to show them. Who knows? Who knows what I'll do at this point. But in the game menus, there's what's called a citizen menu. And from there, you can see each of the 4 districts, as well as the citizens that live there. And if you hover over a citizen card, you can see how much experience they're worth if you kill them. As we've talked about, Jonathan needs blood to survive, and although you can get the blood from rats and vampires and other feral okay, let's try that again. You can get that blood from rats, vampire hunters, and feral vampires, but the best sources from the citizens, because the blood that you get from those other sources, like in combat or whatever, they don't actually grant you experience points. They just give you blood in your blood meter, or they give you health. Whereas when you drink from the citizens, you actually get experience points. And killing citizens is actually pretty eerie the first time you do it. There's this choral swell of voices, and it's all very ominous. In fact, the first time that I was prompted to kill a citizen, I opted to let them go instead. It seemed to me that the game was kind of signaling through the audio that maybe that was a bad idea. And like I mentioned, there is an achievement that you can get for beating the game without killing any citizens, but of course I did not get that achievement. The reason being because there were a few encounters that I could not beat until I had fed on a few citizens and leveled up. So that one encounter that I was talking about, where there was like the 6 vampire hunters and 3 of them were ranged, and they all had fire and stuff. I did that a few times and realized these people were just wiping me easily. I needed something to help me out, and so I went and found a few citizens, and then I leveled up. So as you're looking at these citizens, though, in the interface, so for example, let's consider a certain citizen named Stella Fishburne. At the time of my beating the game, she was worth like 1400 XP if I were to kill her. But she was also sick. And so if you can cure her fatigue or whatever she has, then she's actually worth a lot more. She's probably worth around 2000 or 2500. And so if you wanted to kill a citizen, you should make sure that you cure them first, which is kind of morbid when you think about it. Now, another thing about killing citizens is that you get to hear their final thoughts. And this is kind of morbid as well. It's because sometimes they're sad or angry, or maybe they actually always suspected that you were a vampire and now they know for sure, but now it's too late. Sometimes their thought is like of a loved one. And that kind of makes you feel bad when you hear that. Now, the proximity of the citizen portraits in the citizen menu actually indicates a relationship. So, for example, let's say there's a citizen named Edwina Cox, and there's a citizen named Booth Digby, and they share a close relationship, and you're not going to know what that relationship is at the outset. But you can ask about them. You can talk to each of them, see how they feel about each other. You can ask the people around, see what kind of relationship exists, and that relationship is important. It is important because when you kill someone, it will have an impact on the district. And if you kill someone whom someone else really cares about, then the survivor will suffer because of it. In one case, if you kill someone, their surviving relative will actually become a vampire hunter, and you'll have to face them later as a mini-boss. In my playthrough, I killed a certain citizen, and the next night, the person that she was connected to went missing. And that's kind of foreboding and ominous. And later on, I did end up finding them, and they turned into this huge, high-level feral Volkid, which is that they turned into that big werewolf-looking beast. And it took a lot to bring them down. After that, I began to kill a little bit more strategically. So at one point, I killed a pair of lovers. I was really only interested in the one that granted them more experience, but I didn't want to leave a survivor that could get turned into a vampire or get recruited by the vampire hunters. So I ended up just killing them back to back. And I was actually rewarded with a little bit of romance because their final thoughts were of each other. Now, in the citizen menu, there's going to be a portrait in the center. And this is the pillar of the community. And so each district has a pillar of the community. This is a citizen that influences everything. And if you kill that particular citizen, it's going to affect the entire district, not just one person. Now, that doesn't mean that the entire district is going to go crazy and it's going to become hostile. That is a possibility, but it's not guaranteed. It just means that the district will suffer for it. And if you want to keep that district healthy, then you may have to do some extra work to keep that going. The health of a district is indicated by a health status. And as the health declines, it does become more hostile. So that means that there's going to be more vampires and more vampire hunters in that district. And it also means that some of those citizens could be turned into those mini bosses. The game also says that it has an impact on merchants and their prices. But to be honest, I didn't interact with merchants enough to notice that difference really play out. Another thing I want to talk about is the side quests. So you have your main quests in the game, and these are indicated very obviously, and you know exactly what you should do. But you also have a number of side quests that you get from different citizens. And in the game, they're not called side quests. They're called local investigations. And I'm kind of torn on it. I like that there are local investigations, and I like the way it's implemented. And in the menus, it's demonstrated implemented in a very visual way, which I find interesting. But to be honest, most of the time I forgot that I even had any side quests, and I focused mainly on just keeping the citizens healthy and following through the main storyline. And, this is totally subjective. Maybe that's just my own failing, but I felt like maybe that could have been pointed out to you more. Like maybe when you re-enter a district, it will remind you that, you have some unfinished investigations. I'm not sure. I'm not sure the best way to implement that. I just know that the way it was implemented, at least for me, it was just too easy to forget that I even had anything. And so by the time I finished the game, I still had a lot of mysteries pending where I didn't know the answer, and I just plumb forgot about them. So for the side quests I did complete, I usually completed them right after I got them. So I'd hear about this mystery and it would be intriguing. And rather than thinking, okay, cool, that's interesting, but I'll do it later, it was interesting enough where I just wanted to go do it right away. And so that's what I would do. And then the other type of side quests that I would complete are things that I would do on accident. So, for example, let's say, maybe I kill a mini boss, a named NPC, a named enemy, and I pick up a pocket watch from them, completely forgetting that that watch is associated with one of these local investigations. So I'd go about playing the game, and hours later in the game time, I'd talk to a citizen just randomly, or maybe to cure their illness or something. And I would see that they have an option to return the watch. So of course I'd select that option, and lo and behold, investigation complete. And I'd completed an investigation that I completely forgot that I even had. Part of the problem, I think, is that you can only track one side quest at a time. And maybe that's a good thing. Like, you don't want to clutter up the screen. At least I don't. I don't like the game screen being cluttered up. But I don't know. I just kept forgetting that I even had side quests, and maybe this is totally subjective, but I just think there might have been an easier or better, more clear way to implement that. Now, there are many choices that you'll make in the game, and some of these choices are completely permanent. So, for example, you can choose like whether to save someone, or you can choose whether or not to turn someone into a vampire, or you can choose whether or not to kill someone. And these are big decisions that will impact the end of the game. And of course, I have some problems with that. The first decision that I made that was really big like that, I really didn't understand what I was doing. And after having done it, I looked online and I saw that other people are complaining about this as well. And so I'm inclined to think that this really is the game just not doing enough to telegraph the consequences of this particular decision. But in this case, I actually thought I was doing the right thing. I was like, okay, out of these choices that I have, I think this one will have the most favorable outcome. And I inadvertently killed that person, and they're pretty important to the story. And so I felt like that was unfair, because I was trying to do the right thing, and then it had a completely different outcome. And I think that when you have choices in games, the outcomes need to be really clearly telegraphed. Or if there's a twist, I think that's okay, but it really needs to be good. And it needs to be, well, first off, it needs to be rare. You can't do that too much. And then it needs to have like a really good logical reason, where you can look at it and say, yeah, I guess that's fair. And in this case, I didn't think that was the case. Now, part of this is that the game automatically saves as you go, and you have no option to reload any earlier save. So once you've made a decision, it's permanent. The only way to make a different decision is to start over. So another time that this kind of bugged me is that there's an instance in the game where the game is kind of pushing you in one direction. I'm sorry, it doesn't push you, it forces you. It forces you in a direction. And so if you continue in that direction, then the game will punish you for it. So you get different options after the game forces you in that direction. And to me, I thought, well, this is the game showing me what it wants me to do, and also as a role player, that's the choice I would have made. And then I was punished for that choice at the end of the game, and I felt like that was a little unfair. I think that one's more fair than the first example I gave, but even so, it was just kind of frustrating. It's like, look, I'm trying to do the right thing. I tried to have, I knew I wasn't going to have a perfect playthrough because I was killing citizens, but I was trying to be like the good guy, and I felt like some of the decisions I made, like, they had unintended consequences. And again, I don't think that's necessarily bad on its own. It's just that I didn't feel like that was telegraphed very well, or I felt like the game kind of tricked me in a way into thinking that like one way to play was better than another, and then it wasn't. And I mean, as I'm saying it, like, it's completely subjective, but it's something to keep in mind. Now, part of the issues, or I guess in addition to the issues I just noted, the only real problem that I have with the system of like it saving, this is, yeah, specifically to its saving and not being able to reload saves. And keep in mind that this might be a spoiler, so if that you're sensitive to that, skip ahead a few minutes. But even so, I don't think it's a very big spoiler, but here it comes. The very last part of the game actually does not take place in London, which means that your very last autosave before the credits roll is not in the world that you spent so much time in. And so what that means is that when you are done, you are done. There's no going back. And that sudden change, and the fact that you're at the very end of the game, it isn't incredibly well telegraphed to the player. It could be assumed that the last quest that you go on, well, it's a quest chain, and so the very last quest that you start, or that last chain rather, it feels very similar to all the other ones. Like there's nothing special about it. You don't know that it's the last one. There's no closure with any of the citizens that you talk to. But when you enter that last area, that's it. There is no backing out. You can only go forward through the last several stages of the quest, meaning that your time is basically over in London. Now, this may just be my own fault, but I had several side quests that I still wanted to complete. And I had some citizens where I had not really taken the time to learn about them as much, and I really wanted to go back and do it. And there were some mysteries that were left hanging also that I still don't have a resolution from. I'm debating whether I want to just read about it online or if I want to play through again. And I think I'm probably going to opt to play through again. So there's some mysteries in the game that I'm not going to know until I do that. And because of the autosave system and the fact that the last location that you play in the game is not in London, like I don't have the opportunity to go back and do those side quests or go back and talk to those citizens or solve those mysteries. And I can see kind of why the devs made that choice. I think it really solidifies the fact that all of your choices in the game are permanent. I just wish that I would have known that the last mission was the last mission so that I could take a little bit more time to get out everything from the game that I wanted to get out of it, rather than having to be done and now consider, okay, well, when am I going to play again? So let's talk about the finale of the game, or the ending. There are two finales in the game, and they correspond to the two primary mechanics in the game. So there's a combat finale, where you fight a final boss, and I don't consider that a spoiler, that's how all games are. Then there's another finale that's rooted in dialogue. Now I'm going to do my best not to spoil anything here, but keep in mind that we are talking about the endings. And in both of these finales, the time of influencing the outcome of the game has already passed. Now, I don't know if this is a spoiler in particular. I mean, this whole section is kind of we're walking the line, and I'm not going to say exactly what happens, but just keep that in mind. In the fight with the final boss, you either win or you try again. There's no viable failure state. There's nothing left to do but finish, and this is true of the dialogue finale as well. At that point, you're really just going through the motions. You can choose your dialogue options, but it's not to change anything. You're choosing dialogue options because you want to learn more about the world, or you want to learn more about what's happening at the point. You're not changing anything. And so you talk with people and you get through it. You can't change anyone's mind at that point. Your past decisions have culminated already, and the impact that you've had on other characters has already been made, and they've made decisions in reaction to your choices. And by this point, it's too late to change anyone's mind. All you can do is watch it play out. So as for the actual ending, again, we're kind of in spoiler territory here. Light spoilers, I would say. There are 4 different endings that you can get depending on the choices you make in the game. 2 of these are considered good endings, and 2 are considered bad endings. And in my playthrough, you may be able to divine the fact that I got a bad ending. Not the very worst ending, but it was still bad. And I'm torn on whether or not I really deserve that, because like I said, I did my best to not kill too many citizens, and I made the decisions that I thought were best through the game. There's another decision that I made towards the end of the game that I really thought, and I wish I could, if this was spoiler full, like if I felt safe talking about spoilers, I would totally go into this. But there's a decision I made that I really felt like it was the best decision. Like, it was definitely a gray area morally, but I still feel like that was a good decision. And after reading about the different endings later on, I realized that that's actually one of the decisions that gave me a kind of a worse ending. And I'm not sure how I feel about that. I feel like the game and we have a disagreement over certain moral issues. Even so, I got a bad ending, not the worst, but a bad one. And that was despite my attempts to really make the best choice that I could, aside from not killing citizens. I killed a few citizens, not very many though, surprisingly few. But even so, in the last few minutes of the game, I could already see what was coming, and I tried to fix it. I did. In all the dialogue options and everything I could do, I tried to fix it. But of course, by then it was too late. My choices had already been made, and the wheels of fate were already in motion. And despite everything that I tried to do in those last minutes, I got the ending I got. And yeah, that was my experience with Vampyr. It has some issues, I think, but despite those issues, I really did like the game. And I think the fact that I'm torn on so many of the choices, or I feel like there's some moral ambiguity that isn't really cleared up. I feel like those things are actually good. I mean, to have any emotion about a game, I think is good. And so if a game makes you feel something, isn't that like an accomplishment? You know, if you're watching a movie or reading a book, any type of art that can make you feel something and something positive. You know, I don't think there's a lot of room. No, maybe I do. You know, I think that there's something to be said for art that makes you feel positive or makes you feel empowered or makes you feel capable or self-confident. I think it's possible that there's art that makes you feel less. It breaks you down or it makes you feel something negative. And I think that that's not always a good thing. It's not always a bad thing either. Sometimes you need to have things brought to light so that you can consider it and work through it. And art, I don't know, sometimes art does that and sometimes it does it effectively, but I think that art that makes you feel good is the most profitable as far as like what it's doing for you as an individual. But that's just my opinion. You know, your opinion may vary radically from mine, and that's totally fine. I'm in no way trying to assert that my own opinion is correct. It's just another opinion. But I did like Vampyr. It was exactly what I needed at the time, and I enjoyed playing through it, and I found the experience to be rewarding. I mentioned at the start of this video that Vampyr is a AA game, and I think that the issues that I had with the game could probably be traced to that, because the game just didn't have the scope that the story maybe deserved, or maybe would have helped it to reach a higher potential. But the game is still great as it is, and in my opinion, it's totally worth playing. It is on the shorter side. It took me about 26 hours to beat it. And I think that if you stick to the main missions, it actually goes by much quicker, especially if you don't care about keeping the districts healthy. Like if you're just, like a freight train railroaded on that path of finishing the game, you could probably finish it in like 15 hours, I think. Maybe even less. But if I would have done a little bit more of the side quests and engaged with more of the citizens like I wanted to, it probably would have taken me a bit longer, maybe like 30, 35 hours, maybe even 40. I think the completionist run, if you look it up, is estimated to take about 40 hours or so. The game at full price is $40 US, and is it worth the price tag? In my opinion, it is. But should you play Vampyr? Well, if anything that you've seen or heard sounds interesting to you, then I would say yes, you should. I put it off for a long time. Just thought, I thought it looked interesting, but I didn't know if it was for me. And after playing it, I realized that I did like it quite a bit. But I think the make or break for most people will actually be the combat. If you like the combat, or if at least you can deal with it, if you can hang with it, then I think you'll enjoy Vampyr. If you don't like the combat, then a lot of this game is just going to feel like a chore to you. Either way, that is all from me, and I appreciate all of you, and I hope you have a wonderful week, month, and year. If you like this video, go ahead and give me a thumbs up and consider subscribing to get more content just like this. If you didn't like it, give me a thumbs down. Believe it or not, that type of feedback is helpful as well. Either way, let me know your thoughts on Vampyr in the comments. I called it Vampyr. Let me know your thoughts on Vampyr down in the comments below. Thank you all.